For today's lecture, we're going to talk about plants, which may seem boring to some people, but I assure you plants are amazing. And by the time I get to the end, you're going to like them a lot more than you do. So what is a plant? A plant is any organism that lives in a permanent space, absorbs nutrient water from the soil through roots, soiled with an asterisk from some sort of substrate, and produces its own sugars through photosynthesis. So they always are photosynthetic organisms. The parts of a plant that you need to know, starting at the bottom, are the roots. The roots attach to the soil or whatever other substrate the plant is growing on. Coming up out of the soil is a stem that's going to provide support for the plant and in most plants conduct fluid. Then leaves are big, wide things that grow off of a stem and provide surface area for photosynthesis. And then flowers, if flowers are present, are the reproductive structures of the plant. So yes, if you give your mom a bouquet of flowers for Mother's Day, you are giving your mom a bunch of flower genitalia. And the job of the flowers is to spread the gametes and provide a site for fertilization, and to then grow the seeds that will become the next generation. All right, so let's look at a picture of a cactus. And looking back here, notice that the leaves grow off of the stem and the flowers grow off of the stem as well. So what part of the cactus is the stem? Well, on the cactus, the stem is this big wide thing. So this part of the plant that seems like it would be a big thick leaf, that's actually the stem. And notice here we have one flowering with all these flowers growing off of that stem. So what part of the plant is the leaf? The leaves are the needles of the plant. So they're very, very reduced. So in this plant, in cactus, rather than relying on the leaves for photosynthesis, the stems are actually the main photosynthetic site. We're going to talk about plant life cycles, and I don't want you to know all the details about all the life cycles, but I do want you to know this basic system. And that is that there are two multicellular stages. Now this is different from mammals where the gametes, which are haploid, are only unicellular, one cell, and then they fuse together to make a diploid cell that then does mitosis and creates a multicellular organism. In plants, in most plants, the main plant is a sporophyte, which is diploid. Okay, it's got two of each chromosome. And rather than making gametes through meiosis, it makes spores through meiosis. And those spores are of course haploid, one of each chromosome. And they then do mitosis to create another multicellular generation called the gametophyte. And then the gametophyte is going to do mitosis. And at one stage in that mitosis, it's going to produce the gametes, eggs and sperm, from mitosis, not by meiosis, but by mitosis. And then those will fuse to create a zygote that then goes through mitosis to create a new diploid organism. Okay, so this is a really different life cycle from what we've learned before. For plants, they have a sporophyte that is multicellular and a gametophyte that is multicellular. And you can just remember that the sporophyte makes spores and the gametophyte makes the gametes. All right, so we're going to start with the very simplest plants, which are really different from most plants and in fact don't even have real roots. These are the non-vascular plants. The vascular system in a plant is the system of tubes that carry water, minerals, and sugars from one part of the plant to another. So if you don't have a vascular system as a plant, how do you carry water and sugars and minerals from the soil. How do you carry that stuff from the soil or whatever you're growing on to your leaves? And the answer is that they have to do diffusion. Everything gets transported by diffusion. So how does this limit them? It means that they can't be very big because there's a limit to how far water and minerals can diffuse. So all of these non-vascular plants are going to be very, very small. And in fact, you probably just ignore them. Although if you look at them with even just a magnifying glass, they're absolutely amazing. So these are some examples of mosses, which have these teensy tiny little leaves. Liverworts, which make these structure here. This is another liverwort here. And then there's another group called hornworts that's much more unusual. In these plants, the main part of the plant, the main thing that you see when you see moss, that's actually a gametophyte. It's haploid. And those make gametes by mitosis. And then those gametes fuse together on the female plant and create this sporophyte. And the sporophyte grows out of the gametophyte. So it's this big long stalk with this structure at the top where meiosis happens and spores get made by meiosis. So this stalk and this sporangium at the top, those are the only parts of this that are diploid. Everything else is haploid. Sorry, I just realized I had a typo in there. Let's go back to our slideshow. There we go. Okay. So this is all gametophyte, this is sporophyte. And if you look closely at moss that you see around, if it's been living in good conditions, then you will see these little sporophyte structures sticking out of it. The other cool thing about mosses is that they can rehydrate after being dried out. So this video is going to show you a moss. We can see it's kind of looks dried out, and just as soon as you put it in the water, it starts rehydrating and the leaves unfurl. So you can see this one right here uncurling, and it will start doing photosynthesis right away. And in fact, this is how people who study mosses, this is how they keep samples. They just dry them out and put them in an envelope. And then if they want to study them again, you just put some in a drop of water or in several drops of water, and it will rehydrate. So one of the ways that people distinguish one moss from another is by looking very closely at the leaves. And for a lot of mosses, the leaves are only 1 or 2 cells thick. So you can actually, if you look at the individual leaves of a moss under a microscope, you can actually see very clearly whether there's 1 or 2 cells in the leaf, which is kind of cool. So those are the mosses. The next group are vascular nonseed plants. And these were the next group of plants to evolve. So they do have a vascular system. They have a set of tubes that move water, minerals, and sugars through the plant. They don't make seeds. They make spores. And the main group of vascular nonseed plants are the ferns that have these big, long, beautiful fronds. Those fronds grow from these little structures called fiddleheads. And so this fiddlehead is this curved structure with all these little curved structures. And as they grow, they unfurl and uncurl to create these fronds. The other thing you notice about ferns is that they often have these little brown bumps on the back, and that's actually the reproductive structures. Those are sori. Sori is plural, sorus is singular. And inside that, meiosis is happening, producing spores. So this main plant is the sporophyte. It is diploid. And the spores are doing meiosis. The sori are, meiosis is happening inside there. and they're producing spores, and then those spores will create the next generation. So this is what the fern life cycle looks like. So you have this mature fern plant. Here's a new little fiddlehead growing. This is a diploid plant, so 2 of each chromosome. And on the underside of the leaves, these little spots are, each of these is a sorus with a bunch of sporangia in it. And inside each of those sporangia is meiosis happening, creating haploid spores. So the sporangia then pop open, disperse the spores. If the spores land somewhere that they can grow, they start doing mitosis. Now remember, these are haploid organisms. They grow into a young gametophyte, and then that mature gametophyte then will grow an archegonium that houses an egg, and an antheridium that can make sperm, and the sperm will travel through to the archegonium and fertilize it. And yes, this can be on the same organism because they don't have to be diploid to have a sex. So they can be both male and female in one. The archegonium gets fertilized, the egg inside there gets fertilized, and then that becomes a zygote that is now diploid, that does mitosis and grows up into a new sporophyte plant. And that sporophyte plant is actually going to start growing out of this little gametophyte. And then that gametophyte is going to grow and become the roots of the fern plant. So those are the ferns still producing by just dispersing spores, no seeds. So the next group of plants that evolved, we called the gymnosperms. These are vascular plants. They do have a vascular system. They make seeds, but they don't make flowers. We call them, so they're non-flowering plants. And there are 3 groups of plants in this group, this phylum of plants. Phylum? Yeah. The cycads, the ginkgos, and the pines. The one thing they all have in common is that they make seeds, and those seeds are not inside a fleshy fruit. And that's actually what gymnosperm means. Sperm means seed, and gymno actually means naked, which yes means that a gymnasium is in fact a place for naked people, because the Greeks who named the gymnasium used to exercise in the nude. More you know. So here's some cycads. And you can see they really look like palm trees, but they're not. Palms are actually flowering plants. Cycads have this this main central trunk with these big frond-like leaves growing off of it. And then when they reproduce, they put up this big sort of cone structure in the middle. And this is going to be covered with structures that will create seeds. So those are the cycads. They're really popular as a landscaping plant, and most of the species of cycads that exist today are endangered. So it is actually good for people to plant them because then the species will stick around. The ginkgos, like Ginkgo biloba, are a group of plants with this really distinct leaf pattern. And they're really interesting because the trees are either male or female, but they're not both. And so if you want to reproduce ginkgo trees, you have to have 2 different trees. You have to have a male tree and a female tree. Then the other ones are the pines. And pine trees are often male and female in the same plant, what we call hermaphrodites. The thing that you know as the pine cone is in fact the female cone. This is where the ovary of the pine sits. It sits at the base of the scales of this cone. The male cone is this tiny little structure here. It's really, really tiny, and all it does is produce pollen and release that pollen. So the pine life cycle looks like this. So here is our mature tree. It's a sporophyte. It is diploid. it produces a female cone and a male cone. Sometimes they will be on the same branch. Often with some kinds of pine trees, they'll put the female cones at the top of the tree and the male cones at the bottom of the tree, so that if the pollen just falls from the male cones, it doesn't fall onto its own cones. In order to get pollen, pollen has to be brought usually by the wind from another tree. So that's one way that the plants avoid self-pollination. So each of these little things on the cone is called a scale. And at the bottom of the scale, there is the site where the ovary sits. And there are usually 2 ovaries per scale. In the male cone, there are these little tiny scales where sperm is made. And that's meiosis is happening, creating spores that then grow to become the egg and sperm. It's a little complicated. So the megaspore becomes the female, the microspore is the male. They do meiosis to create, and then mitosis to create the male and female, and then they meet, and the egg develops into a seed, and then that seed, when the cone opens like this, those seeds get dispersed. So that's how pines reproduce. You don't need to know everything about these life cycles. For this one, I really just want you to know that's the male cone, that's a female cone. Okay, now the main group of plants are called the flowering plants, and they are called angiosperms. So these have a vascular system, they make seeds, and those seeds are made at the base of flowers. The vascular plants have a huge diversity of size and color and shape of flowers, and they are divided into 2 main groups. But first, let's look at their life cycle. So the whole point of the flower is to produce both, often in the same flower, sperm and egg. Not always. Some plants continue to be separate male and female. For example, zucchini is a plant that is, the flowers are either male or female. So the male part has this anther, and within the anther, meiosis happens to produce a microspore that then does mitosis and produces a pollen grain that actually has 2 nuclei in it. So it's actually 2 cells within one. That's called the gametophyte. Within the within the ovary, there is an ovule, and this is the megasporangium. This is the microsporangium in the anther. This is the megasporangium. This is going to do meiosis to create a megaspore that stays inside this ovary. It's then going to do mitosis to create 8 nuclei inside this ovary. One of those nuclei is going to become the egg. The others are going to produce most of the structure of the seed. The pollen grain is going to travel to the stigma, which is the top of this female portion of the plant. And it's actually going to grow what we call a pollen tube. The pollen tube grows down through this style and around the ovule to release the 2 nuclei here. One of those is going to fertilize the egg, and the other is going to fertilize 2 other nuclei to create an endosperm. So the zygote becomes the embryo of the next generation, a zygote, a diploid organism. The endosperm is actually triploid and is going to form the nutritious portion of the seed that the new embryo will use to grow before it can start doing photosynthesis. So that's what you're eating when you eat seeds. You're actually eating both, you're eating haploid nuclei, these up here are still haploid, a diploid organism, and a triploid organism in the androsperm. How wackadoodle is that? So then we have this organism developing inside the seed. And sometimes you can, if you break apart a seed, you'll see like a little nubbin growing in there. That's actually the embryo. That is diploid. That is then going to feed off the nutrients from this triploid endosperm and develop into a plant if it lands in the right place. And then it develops into the sporophyte, and then if it's lucky, grows up to be a nice mature plant to produce its own flowers and start the cycle all over again. How crazy is that? So in both the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, we see the gametophyte that stays in the ovary of the female plant. And the gametophyte from the male travels to the female and sends its nuclei into the female ovule. Okay? All right, now the two classes of flowering plants. They're monocots and dicots. Monocots, one seed part, and when it first grows, when the sporophyte first sprouts, it produces one leaf. Dicots, a two-part seed, and when they first sprout, they produce two leaves. Grasses, corn, lilies, and tulips are all monocots. And the way you distinguish them is that you look at the leaves, and the veins in the leaves are parallel to each other. Don't say that the leaves are parallel. It's the veins in the leaves that are parallel. The petals in monocots are in groups of three, multiples of three. So here's 3 petals here, and then these 3 outer petals here, which are not actually petals, but I'll come back to that. If something has more than 6 petals, it's a dicot. Don't even bother counting. Dicots are all the other things you think of as flowering things, including palm trees, which you may not have thought of as flowering. The veins in the leaves are branched in a net-like branching pattern, and the petals are in multiples of 4 or 5. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here we have a lot. If that many petals, it's always a dicot. There's no such thing as a monocot that makes that many petals. So, is a cactus a monocot or a dicot? Well, we can't really look at the leaves. We can't see the veins in the leaves. But we can look at the flowers. And if we look at the flower, we can see that there's, well, at least more than 6 petals on these flowers. So this is definitely a dicot. Okay? All right, so this is poison oak, and this is one of really the only plant that I want you to be able to identify. Poison oak is the only poisonous plant in Southern California, asterisk. We have one plant that only grows after rains. It grows pretty high up in the mountains. It makes these gorgeous purple flowers, but it only grows for a couple of years after rain. So this is the only one that you're really going to have a chance to come in contact with generally. All of these, with all these different shaped leaves, these are all poison oak. Poison oak comes in a lot of varieties depending on the environment it's growing in. There are a bunch of strains of poison oak. But the way you can distinguish it is that there are always 3 leaves on one petiole. Now, a lot of plants have 3 leaves at the end of a petiole, but then they have other leaves on that same petiole behind it. So you'd have 1, 2, 3, and then another one here and here, another pair here and here. Poison oak has only 3 leaves. So you may have heard the phrase, leaves of 3, let it be. That is correct. It's the only plant that that you will find growing here that has 3 leaves growing off of one little petiole. That's this little stalk branching stem off of the main stem. All right, so let's learn all the parts of the flower. Like I said, the flower does have a female reproductive portion and a male reproductive portion. The female portion is called the pistil or the carpel, and the top of it is called the stigma, and that's the part that the pollen lands on and sticks to. So you can remember that the stigma is sticky. Then the tall portion under the stigma is the style, and if a pollen has landed on it, it can grow a pollen tube down through the style. And then the ovary sits at the bottom and is usually inside the base of the flower. Sometimes it's actually at the top of the stem instead. And inside of the ovary, there's one or more ovules. Each ovule can develop into a seed. So for a plant like this with multiple ovules, this could grow a seed with or a fruit with multiple seeds in it. The male part is called the stamen, and it's made up of the anther where the pollen grains are actually made, and that anther is held up on a filament. Okay, so that's the filament. Filament, anther, together they make the stamen. And the flower's job is to advertise itself to pollinators who will come, gather pollen from the stamen, and then carry it to another flower and get that pollen onto the stigma. So we'll talk about how flowers are shaped to make that happen. Around the pistil and the stamen are the petals. Notice that petal is spelled P-E-T-A-L. P-E-D-A-L is the thing you push on a bicycle. So please do not misspell petal. It is a petal. The sepal is a modified petal or leaf that surrounds the bloom, the bud before it blooms. So if we go back here, these little green things here, these are all the sepals. So they were around the bud before it opened, and then they open with the bud. The receptacle is the part of the flower that holds the ovary, and then the whole thing sits on a pedicel or a petiole. All right, so let's look at this flower. First of all, is it a monocot or a dicot? How do we know? Count the petals and look at the leaves. You can see the leaves branch, the veins in the leaves branch out, so that looks like dicot. How many petals? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep, it's a dicot. Now let's look at the parts inside the flower. So we've got this, these tall things here with sort of yellow tips on them, and then these things out here with these brown tips on them. Those are actually different. So these are the stigmas of the styles, and this is the style. And then these things out here, these are the filaments with the anthers on top. Okay, the female parts pretty much always in the center with the anthers around them. All right, now pollination is the movement of the pollen from the male plant to the ovary of the female plant. And plants don't want to be self-pollinated, although they can self-pollinate, most of them. They want their pollen to mix to another plant so that the gene pool keeps getting stirred. I know, plants don't actually want anything. They're plants, but it is beneficial to the species. So some of the simplest just rely on wind. So these are actually the flowers of grass. Grass flowers are different because they don't have petals. So what you're looking at here are just naked genitalia, just naked anthers and stamen. And pistils. So these rely on wind to carry the pollen to another flower. Sometimes water lilies are actually water pollinated, meaning that the pollen actually just falls into the water and current carries it to another plant. Most flowers, or many flowers, rely on animals to pollinate their flowers. And the shape of the flower is going to reflect what sort of animal pollinates it. So flowers that are pollinated by birds, such as hummingbirds, tend to be very long and narrow because hummingbirds have a really long beak with a long tongue. And these are also going to make pollen, which is just sugar water, which the hummingbirds feed on. As they do that, they get the anthers. The anthers hit their forehead, they get pollen on their forehead, and then when they go to the next flower, the pollen from their forehead rubs off onto this stigma. Bats are really important pollinators, and in fact are probably worth many, many millions of dollars in pollination for crops. Plants that are pollinated by bats often have flowers that open at night and are either white or yellow, so that bats can more easily see the flowers at night. Flowers that rely on other insects are often wide and flat. So yes, flies are important pollinators. Flowers that rely on flies that eat dung and carcasses sometimes smell like poop and carcasses. So there are some really bad smelling flowers in the world. Flowers that are pollinated by beetles sometimes don't have any odor at all, but they do tend to be wide and flat to give the beetles area to walk around and land. Bees gather the pollen from flowers to make honey to feed their offspring. So plants that are fertilized by bees are going to make lots and lots and lots of pollen. And then moths and butterflies also are really good pollinators, and they have these very long mouth parts that they can use to seek down into the flowers for nectar. So again, we're going to have flowers that produce nectar to attract these pollinators. So here again is that life cycle. So all of these pollinators are responsible for bringing this little pollen grain from the male part of one flower to the female part of another flower, and hopefully getting it into or on the stigma, the sticky stigma of the female part of the flower. All right. That female part of the flower, remember, the ovule then grows up into a seed, and in the flowering plants, that seed is surrounded by a fleshy fruit. Now, not all of the fruits are really, really fleshy. In peas and beans, the pod, the pea pod or the seed pod, is the fruit, and it can have multiple seeds inside. So the peas or the beans are the seeds. A raspberry is actually a bunch of individual berries that came from a very complicated ovule with lots and lots of ovaries. The pineapple, each of these segments develops from a separate carpel or pistil in this flower. So the flower is very, very complicated. And each of these little parts that puts out, each of these little parts is an individual flower. Each one has its own pistil or carpel, and each one develops into a section of the pineapple fruit. Apples, on the other hand, are really, really simple in comparison. You have a flower with one ovule in the center, and an ovary with several an ovule with several ovaries, so that you can make several seeds in the center of the apple. Now, most of the things that you think of as fruits and a lot of the things that you think of as vegetables are actually biologically categorized as berries. What does that mean? And what do you mean there's no such thing as a vegetable? A vegetable is a dietary classification. It's not a biological or botanic classification. A vegetable is something that is more savory than it is sweet, whereas fruits tend to be sweeter and not savory. But biologically, we categorize fruits and parts of the plant based on their function for the plant. So a berry is a fleshy fruit surrounding one or more seeds. So a watermelon, lots of flesh with tons and tons of seeds. A tomato, fleshy fruit, tons and tons of seeds inside. Each of these seeds developed from a separate ovary inside the one ovule that became this tomato. Apple, we talked about. Banana, if you slice a banana sideways, you will see the little tiny seeds inside, although modern bananas make very, very small or no seeds, and most banana plants today are in fact sterile. They can't reproduce by seeds. They reproduce, you take more banana plants by taking a cutting of the plant and actually attaching it to another plant through grafting. It's a long thing. Squash are all berries. It's a fleshy thing with lots of seeds inside. Oranges, tangerines, all berries. Drupes are a special form of fruit where there's a fleshy outer covering surrounding a hard protective case that surrounds the actual seed. So this is all the things that you think of as stone fruit. The peaches, the nectarines, cherries, all of these are drupes that have fleshy fruit surrounding this tough covering, and inside that is the actual seed. Raspberries come from a really complicated flower. So we have a different pistil or carpel for each of these little tiny things. So each of the round things on the raspberry comes from its own ovary in its own ovule. So unlike the tomato, where we had one ovary with lots of one ovule with lots of ovaries in it, I don't know why I keep mixing up these terms. Raspberries have tons and tons of ovaries, each with one ovule. So they grow together on this huge receptacle in the center of the flower. So this is what a raspberry flower actually looks like. We have all of these stigma and styles surrounded by the anthers on their filaments. And the raspberry gets produced when all of these get fertilized, and then the thing holding them together, this little tissue on the inside that holds the raspberry together, is left over from this receptacle here at the center of the flower. All right, so what's a strawberry? So this is going to blow your mind a little bit, okay? A strawberry is not a fruit. Now, you may have heard that the strawberry is the only fruit with the seed on the outside. That is actually biologically incorrect. The part that we eat as fruit is in fact all of this yummy red stuff. And I hope this little turtle can make it. He's trying so hard. But what we're actually looking at is a ginormous receptacle, and covering that receptacle are tiny little fruits, and inside each one of these, this little thing that looks like a seed is actually a fruit, and inside that is a seed. So there. All right, so hopefully that has opened your mind to plants. That's the end of that lecture, and we will talk more about that, and then we'll talk about animal diversity next time.